Okay, today's class we'll be studying the Hibernate API and we'll be seeing the different classes and interfaces present in the Hibernate API. See, we have coded our Hibernate program, the client program, using what? Different classes and interfaces. So the same classes and interfaces we'll be studying now and their roles and responsibility. Clear? So see, we generally, when we want to work with Hibernate, the first object what you create is configuration. Configuration con is equal to new configuration. When as soon as you tell that, it is at that time that the Hibernate system starts off. Clear? So if you want to use Hibernate, first you have to start the Hibernate system by creating an object of configuration, and you'll do it by saying configuration con is equal to new configuration. And I have clearly listed there. Notice configuration. What will this do now? It will start the Hibernate system. So once you start the Hibernate system, the main responsibility of the configuration object is to create an object of session factory. Okay, so the session configuration object will create an object of session factory now. So see now, what is session factory going to do? It is a factory for session objects. Yeah, this is the main thing now. It is a factory for session object. Now what do you mean by factory? Factory means it's one class which goes on creating what? Objects at runtime. Yeah. So session factory is based on factory design pattern. Factory design pattern is on Goff design pattern, and session factory is based on the factory design pattern. And what it does is, see, session factory's main duty is to go on creating what? Session objects. Means as soon as you tell sf.open session, one session object will be created. Again, if you say sf.open session, one more session object will be created. Again, if you say sf.open session, one more session object will be created. Like that, from one session factory object, you can go on creating what? As many session objects you want now. So that's what I have represented in the diagram now. See this. From one session factory, you can create either one session object or one more. How many ever session objects you want, you can go on creating now. Clear? Now once you get the session object, next what will you do with the session object? See, session is the main object here. So it is a session object which actually establishes the connection with the database. Okay? After getting the connection with the database, now using the session object, first we get the transaction. We get the transaction and we begin the transaction. And in the transaction we will do our multiple SQL operations. Means I can insert, I can delete, I can update or do anything. So you can do as many operations you want, and after doing all those operations you will commit the transaction. And from one session object you can get what? Multiple transaction. How will you get this now? Session.get transaction. Return type is transaction tx1. Again, if you want, you can tell session.get transaction. Return type is what? Transaction 2 now. So in the second transaction also you can do what? Multiple SQL operations and you can commit it. So now if you notice here, session is a factory for what? Transaction object. So from one session you can create multiple transaction objects. Like that you can go on creating now. Fine. Finally, after using all this, you will say session.close. Session.close means the connection to the database will be disconnected now. Clear? The resource will be released. Clear? So this is how the things are getting executed. So I clearly listed here. What is the role of the session? See, establishes connection with the database. Then it begins the transaction, and it's responsible for doing the required persistent operations with the database. So session responsibility is, these are the three main things of the session object. Are you clear with this? Yes. So I'll be explaining the same code now in detail. So let's see that now. Clear? See, last class I coded and showed you all this Hibernate client code. Yes or no? See, demo.java, this is the client code I coded, and I gave you an overview by writing simple comments now. Exactly what is happening in this line, this line, this line, this line, and all that. The same code I'll go on to explain to you in detail. Clear? The same code I'll be explaining you. So for explaining that, yes, we'll go to our document. In this, you can see something called as Hibernate architecture. So put your next heading as Hibernate architecture. Fine. See this. This is the diagram of your Hibernate architecture now. So here what's happening is, see, we are having our application. This is our application and this is our database. So from our application, we'll store the values into the database now. Clear? So in between this, what I was saying is the Hibernate system now. In the Hibernate system, you can see some classes which we have used now, or classes or interfaces. Which are there? Session factory, session, transaction. So these are the different classes or interfaces which are used while programming the Hibernate client code. But some things we didn't use, like example, transaction factory, connection provider. These are also either class or interface which are present in the Hibernate, but we never use them. Clear? So here in Hibernate system, it has been classified like this. There is something called as high level components and low level components. Now what do you mean by high level components? High level components are classes or interfaces which are used by the developer for programming. Like example, session factory, session, transaction are all high level components. Okay, but transaction factory, connection provider and all are called low level components, and they are not used by the Hibernate developers, and it will be used by the Hibernate system internally now. Okay, not only that, see, there are other APIs also which the Hibernate system will be using internally. Like example is JNDI, JDBC API, JTA API. So these are the different APIs which the Hibernate system will be using internally. Clear? But the developer is going to use only these few classes or interfaces. So that's how it's been classified: high level components and low level components. So high level components are used by developer and low level components are used by the Hibernate system internally. Fine. So now when you are working with Hibernate now, see the Hibernate, the session factory example, will be using some classes or interfaces like transaction factory, connection provider and all internally. Not only that, even your Hibernate system will be using some other API internally. Like example, JDBC API. JDBC API is what? Java Database Connectivity API. See, when you're doing your CRUD operations or persistent operations in the Hibernate, we never write any queries. Like example, insert into and all that. Like in JDBC, what you do. All that code will be generated by the Hibernate itself by using what? JDBC API internally. So the JDBC API is completely hidden by the developer. So it's not exposed to it. So it is completely abstract. Similarly, now next understand what is JNDI. JNDI is used for doing what? Lookup. It's also an API. Now supposingly I want to use data source connections. Data source connection are nothing but what? Connection pooling. If you are using, for that connection pool you will be giving one data source name. And if you want to get the connection from the pool, you will be using the JNDI lookup. Yeah? So if you want, you'll be using that. So that also, so what you will do, we'll not be writing any JNDI API code and all that. That will be used internally by the JNDI API only. So whatever lookup you want to do, whatever name, data source name you want to use, that name you will configure it in hibernate.cfg.xml file. That's it. You'll give only the data source name. If you provide that much name, what will happen now? Hibernate system only will internally do the lookup for that data source connection, and it will establish the data source database connection. Done. So that's what is JNDI API. So we will never be working with these APIs, but it will be used by the Hibernate system internally. Similarly, now JTA. JTA means what? Java Transaction API. So this API is specially designed for doing only transactions. Yeah, and it is a very powerful API which can be used for doing what? Distributed transactions and all that. So if at all you want to do distributed transaction and all in your project, so that time you can take the help of JTA API. So now if you want to use JTA API, again you will configure all these things in the hibernate.cfg.xml file. That's it. So now what will the Hibernate system do? Internally it will use the JTA API and it will provide you the distributed transaction and all that support now. So all these things are low level components which the Hibernate developer will never be seeing it. So only when you are working or writing a Hibernate code, you will be only using the high level components. That's it. So this is about the Hibernate system. So it is using these classes or interfaces in your application. You will write the code, and once you write the code, you will say the whatever entity or TO into the database. So this is the explanation for this architecture. Now one more thing what you are seeing here is the transient object. Okay. Now what is this transient object? The transient object is your entity or domain object. So you will create the object now, employee EMP is equal to new employee or something like that. So it is that object is called as a transient object. So it will be a normal object now, transient object. So it is the object which you want to save it into the database. That object you will give it to what? Session object. You will write now session.save. So when you hand over your object to the session object, session.save when you say, so the same object will be called as persistent object. Yeah. So we'll be seeing this in detail later. But this is just the explanation for this architecture. So are you clear with this architecture? So in detail I have got documented all this now. So we'll start saying all the notes for this now one by one. See, I have clearly explained. In the above Hibernate system, there are some low level components and high level components. Following are the high level components used by the developer. As I told you, these are the high level components. The first one now, configuration. Okay, then the second one which we used was standard service registry builder. The third one, standard service registry. So we used all these classes and interfaces for coding now. Same next, session factory, session, transaction. So these are the high level components. Done? Now see, following are the low level components which will be used by the Hibernate system internally. Which are they? Connection provider, connection, transaction factory, JDBC API, JNDI API, JT API. So these are the low level components. So one by one we'll start seeing now the explanation for all this I'll be giving you now. So first I'll take configuration, then one by one we'll start seeing all the things now. So first I'll be going with the high level components. In the high level components I'll be going with configuration. See, explanation for high level components, and we'll be starting it with configuration. Just see this now. See, configuration is a class. It's actually a class which is present in org.hibernate.cfg package. The Hibernate runtime system will be started by instantiating configuration class first. Means if you want the Hibernate system to start off, first you have to create an object of what? Configuration. As soon as you create an object of configuration, it will start the Hibernate system. So I written it here. See the code. Configuration con is equal to new configuration. So what will this code do now? It starts the Hibernate system. So fine. So after you start the Hibernate system, next see this. Configuration class has an important method called as configure. Configure is a very important method present in what? Configuration class. So after you start the Hibernate system, next thing what you will be doing is what? Call the con.configure method. One by one we are going what you have coded now, all the lines. So what will this method do now? So this method, it will load and parse the Hibernate configuration and Hibernate mapping files. Means you are having configuration mapping file now. So this method, what it will do? It will load those XML files and parse it. Parse it means reads it. Clear? So that is the duty of this method. Next, see this. Configure method is responsible to load and parse all the values in the Hibernate configuration document and all Hibernate mapping documents. Then next, after reading all the values from the Hibernate configuration mapping document, configuration object is responsible to create java.util.properties object. One properties object will be created. How you create it? See this. Con.getProperties. The return type of that is what? Properties. Fine. The java.util.properties object will store all the settings as key value pair. Now all the values were read from your configuration file. So all those values or settings what you have done in configuration file will be parsed and they will be stored in the properties object as key value pair. Means you will be using tag value and all that, no? So they will be parsed and they will be stored as key value in your properties object. Fine. Lastly, see, this is the main thing now. The configuration object is finally responsible to create session factory object. Once the session factory object is created, then there is no use of configuration object. This is the main duty of what? Configuration object. Yeah, it has to create it. So the next class what we will say is standard service registry builder. After writing that much of code, the next line of code what you will be writing is what? Standard service registry builder, SRB is equal to new standard service registry builder. Yes, it is also a class which is available in org.hibernate.boot.registry package. Now it is a builder for standard service registry instances. Means next we have to create an object of standard service registry. To create an object or instance of standard service registry, we need an object of standard service registry builder. So it is this class which will create an object of what? Standard service registry. So we will create this object. That's the thing now, the standard service registry builder. So next we'll go with standard service registry. Fine. So in standard service registry, it is an interface which is available in org.hibernate.boot.registry package. And next, it is responsible to start all the services which have been configured in the Hibernate configuration file, like JNDI service, transaction service, caching, etc. See, in the Hibernate configuration file, we will do a lot of settings. Okay, or we'll configure, like supposingly I want to use, as I told you, data source connections, means connection pooling. So if I want to use connection pooling, I'll be using what? Data source name. But to do the lookup, you need JNDI and all, no? So yes, whatever you want now, you'll be configuring in the hibernate.cfg.xml file. Okay, so then next, if you want distributor transactions, so that also will configure where? In the Hibernate configuration file. Clear? So that is called as transaction service. Then if you want to do caching, caching means what? Maintaining on duplicate copy of the database in your application. Correct? So you can do it. So whatever services you want, all those services you will configure where now? In the hibernate.cfg.xml file or Hibernate configuration file. So fine. So now the duty of standard service registry is what? To start all those services. So that's what it's saying. It is the responsibility to start all the services which have been configured in Hibernate configuration file. So standard service registry's main responsibility is to start all the services. So next, that is why after creating the standard service registry builder, using the standard service registry builder, we create an object of standard service registry so that all our required services will start off now. So that's what we are doing. See this. Following is the way to create an instance of standard service registry. So how will you do it now? You have to write these two lines now. See this. Standard service registry builder. SRB is equal to new standard service registry builder. First create an object of the builder class, and using that standard service registry builder, I will call the apply settings method. Apply settings is a method in standard service registry builder, and I will send the properties argument as an argument to that method. Properties argument is containing what now? All the key value pairs which have been read in the XML file. So all those values will be passed to apply settings method now. Okay, and you will call the build method now. So after you call the build method, the return type is what? Standard service registry. So as soon as this object is created, now all your services, whatever you have configured, will be started. Clear? So that's about standard service registry. Fine. The next thing what we created or worked was session factory. So what is session factory? It is an interface available where? In org.hibernate package. So session factory is a long-lived multi-threaded object. Now what do you mean by that? See, the session factory object should be created only once in your application. You should not create it again and again. Because if at all you want to create the session factory object now, how many lines of code you will write? Just think, configuration con is equal to new configuration. Then you will write con dot configure. Now all the XML files will be loaded and passed. Then you will say con dot get properties. Now all the values which are read from the XML file will be stored into the properties object. Then you will create an object of standard service registry builder. After creating the object of standard service registry builder, you will create an object of standard service registry. Then using the standard service registry, see, this is how you create the session factory object. Means you are using the configuration object only. Configuration dot build session factory is a method present where? Configuration, and you will pass the object of service registry. So means using the configuration object, I will call it the build session factory object, and I will pass the service registry object which I have created now. The return type of this is session factory object. So these many lines of code has to execute, and then only a session factory object will be created. And it's a very expensive process. Why it's an expensive process? See, starting the system, parsing the XML file, loading all the values into properties, then creating standard service registry builder, then using that starting all the services, means you will create the standard service registry that will start all the services. So it will take huge amount of time. So if these many lines of code you go on writing in your application, see, right now till now we are working with standalone application. Imagine you are writing this code in your web application. In your web application, what happens? You will be having multiple modules. In those multiple modules, you will have multiple DAOs. DAO means data access object. So it is in the DAO you will be writing all this Hibernate code now. And since it's your application is a web application, imagine what will happen. You'll have multiple users making the request. Now when multiple users make the request to your application, this code will means the in the DAO will go on getting executed. So if you repeatedly written this code in your DAO, what will happen? Again and again, the session factory object will go on getting created, and it will definitely hit the performance of your application. So it is advisable to create the session factory object only once and use it throughout the application by all the users. So that's the whole idea of session factory. So again and again the session factory object should not be created because it's a very expensive process and it will hit the performance of your application. For doing that only what we do, we write the util class, Hibernate util class. We'll be showing in a moment, so follow that now. So that's why we say session factory is a long-lived multi-threaded object. Means it will never be destroyed. If I'm talking in web applications, okay, and this will be destroyed only when your server shuts down. So as long as your server is running, your session factory object will be running. Yeah, alive. It will not be destroyed only. In our PSVM program, we wrote the code. What we wrote? Session factory.close and all. But in web applications and all, we will not be closing it. It will always be open only and it will be used by the entire application. Clear? Fine. So usually one session factory object should be created for one database. Means for one database you should have only one session factory object. If your application is using multiple databases, then you need to create multiple session factory object. Supposing in your application you have two databases, so that time you'll have to go for two session factory objects. Means one session factory object will represent one database, other session factory object will represent another database. So you have to create two session factory objects. Fine. Session factory object will be created once and it is used by multiple users for long time. As I told you, it will be used for long time. Now it is a factory for session objects. That's the main thing now. Finally what will session factory do? Create the session object. It's a factory now. It will go on creating the session object. So following is the way to create an instance of what? Session factory object. You know how to create the session factory object now. Session factory SF is equal to con.build session factory. So build session factory is a method in configuration class. I'll pass the argument of standard service registry. So that's it. Your session factory object will be created. I clearly commented create the session factory object, use the configuration object. Clear? See, next point. Since you'll have to write the Hibernate client code in various places of your project, session factory object will be created multiple times. We are discussing the problem now. To avoid this issue, we can implement the client code in some utility class. Following is the way Hibernate is the Hibernate util class. We can ensure that one and only one session factory object will be created for the entire application now. So I'll show you the Hibernate util class now. See, this is a Hibernate util class. So this is how the Hibernate util class will be written now, and it is ensured that only one session factory object will be created and used by the entire application now. So how do you do it? See, very simple. We are having three members here in the class. It's a class name is my Hibernate util. One member is session factory is the static variable. Okay, it's a private static final session factory SF. So it's a static final variable which you have got in the class now. Fine. The other two members are two methods. What are the two methods? Build session factory is one method. Other one is get session factory is one method. So we are writing this class now. So what we do? See, the first we'll go with this method now. Build session factory. Return type is what? Session factory, and it is private and static. So it's a private method which cannot be accessed by again any developer or user. Fine. Next. So in this code, in this method, we write the code to initialize what? Session factory. Same code. That's it. We write it. And now what will happen is, see, you will initialize this session factory SF variable. It's a static variable. So the static variable will be initialized as soon as the class is loaded now. So you will just call the method here and you will initialize this SF. You are returning now session factory FCT is equal to con.build session factory. So the reference of this will be returned and it will be stored here now. Clear? And this method also will execute only once because static variables are initialized only once, and that too when the class is loaded. Fine. And it is private. Now nobody can access it as well as nobody can modify it because it's a final variable. Clear? So it will be created once. Now if you want to use it, you want to use that, no? So for that what we do, we write one method called as get session factory. The return type of this is what? Session factory. Add this public static method. So whenever you want your session factory in your application, just you'll be telling what now? My Hibernate util dot get session factory. Return type of this is session factory. So this is how you'll get the session factory in all your DAOs now. So this is a very important interview question. Which one? How do you write a Hibernate util class? So practice this because it's definitely asked in all the interviews. Because in real time what happens when you are developing a web application, you will be using the Hibernate util class. Clear? So this is how it will be written now. Fine. So next is the session object which we worked. Yeah. See, session is an interface available in org.hibernate package. Clear? So session is a short-lived object. The life of session is very short. Means you'll get the session and you'll be closing the session. Session.close you'll be doing it. It's short-lived. Session represents period of time where Hibernate user does multiple persistent operations with the database. Session object is created from the session factory as follows. See, how do you create the session object? Session ses is equal to sf dot open session. From the session factory only we get the session object now. It's a factory. How many ever objects you want, session objects you want, you can go on creating now. Yes. Now what is the main duty of session object now? See, session is the main key object which is responsible for establishing connection, beginning transaction, doing all the required persistent operations. So session is responsible for all this now. Session is called as persistent manager because session is playing a key role in doing all the persistent operations. Whenever session object is created, then when database connection will be established and will be associated with the session. As soon as you write this line now, one connection will be established to the database now. Fine. As long as session is running, connection will be associated with session. Once session is closed, then connection will be closed internally. Means see this code now. As soon as you say sf.open session, you'll get the session. But what it is doing? Uses connection provider and opens one DB connection. So connection provider is a low level component. One more class it is. It will be used internally and will provide one connection. Fine. When you say con.close, connection will be released automatically. That's it. So these two are very important and you have to close the session every time. Otherwise what will happen? The connection to the database will remain open and it's a very expensive resource now. Yes. So whatever database connections you open, you have to close it. So that's why we say session is a short-lived object as compared to what? Session factory, which is a long-lived object. Fine. Now next, session uses connection provider to get the database connection. Session can span to one or multiple transaction and one transaction can have one or multiple database operation. As we discussed, a session is a factory for what? Transaction object. So from one session you can get any number of transaction objects. See this sf.open session, you'll get the session now. After getting the session, what will you tell? Session.get transaction. Return type is transaction 1. And in this transaction, I'll begin it and I'll do all my SQL operations and I'll commit it. But still I have not closed my session now. I only committed the transaction. So using the same session, I'll get one more transaction. Understood? So again see, transaction.begin, again I can do multiple SQL operations and again I can commit. But finally you have to close what? Session. Once you say session.close, now the database connection will be released. So that's what we say. Session is a factory for transaction object and one transaction can do multiple database operation. Very clearly mentioned here. See, session can span to one or multiple transactions and one transaction can have one or multiple database operations. Done? Fine. Lastly, I have mentioned it. Session is the factory for transaction object. When user requests for transaction, session uses transaction factory internally to get the transactions. So transaction factory is one more low level component, one more class it is, or interface, which will be used by the Hibernate system to give the transaction object whenever you call what? Session.get transaction. Whenever you call it, the transaction factory class or interface will return one transaction object for you. Clear? So session is the factory for transactions. Fine. Fine. Here the next class, the transaction class. Let's see this. Transaction is an interface available in org.hibernate package. Transaction is responsible to end the transaction either by doing commit or rollback. Either it will commit or rollback, and ensures that no invalid data is stored in the database. That's the main duty of transaction object. Yes, we completed the explanation for high level components. Now we'll see the explanation for low level components. Yes, in the low level components, the first class what we'll be seeing is connection provider. So it's an interface. It is responsible to provide what? JDBC connection. It will be used by the session objects. Connection provider can provide two types of database connection. One is JDBC connection, other one is data source connection. Yeah, you know there are two types of database connection. One is JDBC connection, other is data source. Data source means connection pooling. You'll be having on JNDI name, and using that JNDI name you can get the connection from the pool. That connection is called as what? Data source connection. So these are the two types of connection you can get. So Hibernate will support what? Both JDBC as well as data source connection. See, connection provider by default provides JDBC connection. If you want data source connection, you need to provide corresponding properties in Hibernate configuration document. Yes, if you are using connection pooling and all that, you'll have to provide that data source name in your Hibernate configuration file. Hibernate system only will internally do the lookup and get you the connection from the pool. That's it. So anyway, all that is done by whom now? Connection provider. This is a low level component, and developer will never work with this. It will be used by the Hibernate system internally. The next class now, or interface, which is transaction factory. It is an interface. It is a factory for transaction objects. So this is the one which goes on creating the transaction objects. So transaction factory will be used by the session objects and not by the Hibernate developers. Transaction factory can provide the two types of transaction, JDBC transaction as well as JTA transaction. See, there are two types of transaction. One is JDBC, other one is JTA. JTA transaction means Java Transaction API is one special API dedicated for doing only transaction. If you want in your application JTA transaction also you can use it, okay, or if you want you can use JDBC transaction also. Hibernate will support both. But if you want JTA transaction, again you'll have to do the configuration in hibernate.cfg.xml file. Fine. See, transaction factory can provide two types of transaction, JDBC as well as JTA. The default transaction which is used by session factory is JDBC transaction. If you want other transactions, you need to write the corresponding properties in Hibernate configuration document. Means you have to configure. If you want to use what? JTA transaction and all that, you have to configure that in the hibernate.cfg.xml file. Fine. So this is about the low level components. Okay, put the next heading as different states of a object in Hibernate. This is the next topic now completely. So see this. In Hibernate we can find three states of object. Clear? Transient object, persistent object, detached object. So when you are reading many books, okay, so many authors go on to use these words, terminology it is. So I'll explain you this terminology, and also one more thing is, it's a very very important interview question. It is asked in interview. What are the different states of an object in Hibernate? So first I'll explain you this with code. After explaining with code, then I'll explain this theory part for you. Clear? So assuming that I'm having one class here called as employee. So it is the entity now. It have private int eid, private string name, private int salary, and you'll have what? Setters and getters. Public setter getter method you'll have now. So this is your entity now. So it is this entity I want to save into the database now, or domain object. Now, so let us see how you write the code for that now. So first I will create an object of that employee. Employee EMP is equal to new employee. And I'll set the two values which I want to store into the database. Set name, I'll give the value Ravi, and the other value which I will give is set salary, that is 1000 rupees. But I'll never set the ID. Yes, why will never set the ID? Because it will be, ID will be generated by the Hibernate itself. Okay, so that ID which gets generated by the Hibernate system only is called as identity. Clear? So identity is nothing but the primary key value which is generated by the Hibernate system. So that's why we will not give the ID. So once when you're saving this object into the database, the ID will be generated. So right now your employee object is not having the ID, and still your Hibernate object means your entity is not participating in what? Any session. Session means you are not saying session.save and all that, means you are still not handed over this object to the Hibernate. So you are still not handed over, you have just created an object now. So you got the object. So this object which is not participating in the Hibernate session, an object which is not participating in the Hibernate session is called as persistent object. Clear? Transient object. An object which is not participating in the session is called as transient object. The first one, transient object. And the state of this object is called as transient state. Clear? The state of this object is called as transient state. Transient state means it does not have any identity. Means if you try to say employee.get ID, you will not get the ID. You will get what? The default value. When you create the object, what will be the default value of your ID? 0, no? That you will get. So try doing it. Int ID is equal to emp.get EID. You call this getter method. Try to find out, you will not get the ID. So here you will not have any identity. Means there will be no identity. Still it has not been generated because you have still not given this object to what? The TO to the Hibernate system. You are not, it's not participating in the Hibernate session now. Correct? So fine. So this is what you mean by a transient object, and the state of this object is called as transient state. Fine. So next what we do after creating this object, see now, I'll write this code, Hibernate code now. Session factory SF is equal to Hibernate util dot get session factory. Means you'll use your util class and you'll get the session factory object. Done. So after you do this, means you're writing the client code now. You'll start the Hibernate system and all that, and you'll get the session factory. Well, after getting the session factory object, or after creating the session factory object, what will you do? You'll create an object of session, and you'll say sf dot open session. Now the session object gets created. From the session, what will you do? You will begin the transaction. Transaction tx is equal to session dot get transaction. Fine. Now you'll say transaction dot begin, and now see what will you do? You will say session dot save, and you'll pass the employee object. Yes or no? So yes. Now the same object which you created, employee object, is participating in the session. We have handed it over to Hibernate session now. It's participating. Now what does this save method do? Means what will Hibernate do now? Okay. See, we are using the session object. Session is actually called as what? The persistent manager. So it is responsible for doing the persistent operation. So it will take this object and sees to that it will be inserted into the database. But before inserting this employee into the database, first what it should do? It should generate an ID for this. So an ID will be generated now. After the ID is generated, now this object will be stored into the database along with the ID. Okay, so the ID and the name and salary will all be stored into the database. But it is the save method of the session object. Means session object is actually the persistent manager. It will do all those things now. So now when our object, means when your object is participating in a session, in this that object is called as what? Persistent object. So an object which is participating in a session is called as persistent object. Same object, see here it was transient, now here it becomes what? Persistent object, and the state of this object is called as persistent state. And in persistent state it will have identity. Identity means what? The primary key value will be generated and it will be stored into that EID. So it will have identity. Clear? Be clear with this. So fine. So this is called as persistent object. So what is a persistent object now? An object which is participating in the Hibernate session is called as persistent object. Clear? And the state is called as persistent state and it will have the identity. So then next I'll say transaction.commit. Sorry. See, after saying session.save, no. For this one, have identity. Correct what you do? You see this. Int id is equal to emp dot get eid you do. You'll get the ID now. What you'll get? Whatever the primary key value is generated, you'll get it. So that clearly shows that your persistent object will have what? Identity. Clear? So fine. After doing this much, you'll close the transaction. Yes sir? Then what will you do? You'll close the session. So session has been closed. But your employee object is still in scope. It's not dereferenced. See, it is still in scope. I can use this employee object. Yes or no? So I can still work with that employee object. How will I work? Assuming that I can access the value. So I'll access and print it. SOP employee ID is, I'll print plus emp dot get EID. I can call the method. Similarly, I'll print SOP employee name is plus emp dot get name. Similarly, I'll print which one? Employee salary is plus emp dot get salary. All the values you can get. Okay? You can call the getter methods. Get ID, get name, get salary, you get it. Yes. Now you can still work with that object. Why? Because the object is still in scope. EMP is still in scope, but you can still work with that and it is not dereferenced. I'm working. So it is in this object, means after closing the Hibernate session, means you have removed this object from the Hibernate session or it's gone. It is not participating in the Hibernate session. After you close the session, you are working with that object. Clear? So this object is called as, very important now, detached object. Means an object which has been removed from the Hibernate session is called as detached object. An object which has been removed from the Hibernate session or detached from the Hibernate session is called as detached object. And the state of this is called as detached state. And the last thing is it will have identity. You can try to call the get EID method, you'll find it. Yes? So that's what is important. So you have to understand now, both the persistent object and the detached object will have what? Identity, but the transient object will not have the identity. So when you are writing your Hibernate code, you should be very, very clear with this. Understood? And this will help you a lot, the three states of the object. So this is also a very important interview question. And whenever you read books, even the Hibernate authors or documents and all, they'll be talking the same object with this terminology. What? It's in the persistent state, transient state, detached state. So when they talk like that, you have to understand about that state of the object. Clear? So these are the three objects and their state: transient object, persistent object, and detached object and their state. Fine. So the same thing I have documented now. Okay. We'll see it. Clear now? See different states of an object in Hibernate. In Hibernate we can find three states of an object. Transient object, persistent object, detached object. Transient object, the first one now. Object which is not participated in any Hibernate operation is called as transient object. The state of this object is called as transient state. When object is in transient state, it does not contain any identity, means primary key value. Persistent object, object which is participated in the Hibernate session operation is called persistent object. The state of this object is called persistent state. When object is in persistent state, it contains an identity. Detached object, an object which is just removed from the Hibernate session is called detached object, and the state is called as detached state. When object is in detached state, it contains identity, but you cannot do persistent operations with that identity. Means you can work with that object, but you can't do persistent operations. It means it will not be updated into the database if you work with what? Detached object. Clear? Fine. So in today's class, I just explained you this Hibernate architecture now. This diagram clearly I have explained to you, and slowly you will start getting clear idea. See, this is just a summary. You are having the application, and this will be the database. So you will use this high level components and write your code. These low level components will be used internally now. Clear? And in your application you will have the transient object. That transient object you will send it to the session. So when the object is participating with the session, or when the session object is using your object, it becomes what? Persistent object. The same transient object in this stage becomes what? Persistent object. And when the session is closed, it becomes detached object. So detached object has not been shown in this diagram. So this is the clear explanation of this diagram now. Very crucial. When you are reading books, this diagram will be coming quite often. Clear? So that's the thing about the Hibernate architecture. Are you clear with this? Fine, this is the Hibernate architecture. Okay, that's it then.